society needs to both address and confront the perpetrators, the monsters, but also at the same time address the culture that allows abuse to continue.
So how can an attorney help survivors of sexual abuse to regain their power? Well, that's what we're going to find out right now, because that's what we're going to ask the lawyer on this episode. Hi again, everybody. I'm Rob Rosenthal with AskTheLawyers.com, and my guest is New Mexico attorney Shannon Kennedy. I want to let you know right off the top that if you'd like to ask Shannon questions about your situation, it's easy. Just go to AskTheLawyers.com, click the button in the upper right-hand corner that says Ask a Lawyer, and it'll walk you right through the very simple process. Or you can call the phone number that you'll see on the screen during our conversation. Shannon, it's good to see you. Thank you so much for helping us out.
Good to see you.
So let's just start. Let's talk a little bit about your experience, your background in this area. Tell me a little bit about your experience helping clients who have experienced sexual abuse.
Well, I've been a civil rights lawyer for approximately 25 years, and one subject area that I've focused on is that of the sexual abuse of children, school children, by educators and coaches. And I had the privilege of representing a family of a young girl who in first grade was sexually molested by a substitute teacher in the classroom with two other little girls. And through the process of suing the educator who used his position of power to exploit these children, we were able to win a multi-million-dollar verdict for that child. And in that process began representing other families that unfortunately had to face the nightmare of being betrayed by an educational system and or a coach.
So one of the things I know that you do is you help to empower the clients by telling their stories. Tell me a little bit about more of that.
Well, a key to that first case was we had a successful criminal prosecution of the educator molester. So liability was not at issue. In other words, there's no question that this is what had happened. The only question was the harms and losses suffered by the child and the child's family. And so we really focused our case on prosecuting the sexual offender, and focusing on not the act itself, not the salacious act itself, which oftentimes the media can be sidetracked by focusing on the molestation instead of on the harms caused by the molestation. So the child in that case did not have to testify because it was clear he had pled guilty, that what had happened. And instead we had professionals testify about the psychiatric injuries caused by sexual assault. And we created a psychiatric life care plan to explain that essentially the body keeps the score, and that throughout the life of a survivor of sexual assault will be hurdles not met by people not traumatized by a betrayal of sexual assault.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you're also able to help victims who might want to remain anonymous?
Well, no. You cannot remain anonymous. A child has the protection of proceeding in litigation through initials. So they do not have to disclose their identity, but they're not anonymous. Okay. All the parties in the court know who they are. There has been a shift, I would say, in the last 20 years where the shame of the sexual molestation has been taken from the shoulders of the child and the survivor of sexual abuse and shifted to where it belongs, on the shoulders of the perpetrators and those that cover up sexual abuse rather than expose it.
And speaking of covering up, explain what institutional abuse is and how you decide who's to be held responsible in those kind of cases.
Well, oftentimes there can be two injuries resulting from sexual trauma abuse. The first injury, of course, is the trauma of the sexual abuse itself, the dissociation that takes place, the chronic PTSD that can arise from not being safe in one's own body. But the second level of abuse and betrayal is institutional abuse and betrayal. And we've seen that exposed in what the U.S. gymnastics team did to, the hundreds of young female gymnasts who were betrayed by, one doctor. He was only able to continue his cycles of abuse because the reality of the survivors was not acknowledged by institutions. So institutional trauma is compounding. It's a rubbing of the salt in the wound of the original trauma. And society needs to both address and confront the perpetrators, the monsters, but also at the same time address the culture that allows abuse to continue.
When it's institutional abuse, how do you decide who's to be held responsible? Is it ultimately whoever's running the institution? Is it how does that work?
Well, certainly the institutions have to be held responsible, and the institutions have to change policies so that survivors of sexual abuse are supported, are believed, and that there's dignity in the process itself. Part of creating dignity for survivors is training people to whom the survivors must report on how to do what's called a trauma-informed interview. In other words, you do not make a survivor a suspect. Instead, you understand memory as it is created in the moment of trauma, and you conduct interviews that support the exploration of the event instead of essentially a soft cross-examination of a person who's a survivor, not a suspect. And so, for instance, the FBI agents that re-traumatized the young gymnasts that came forward because they weren't trained in treating survivors as opposed to criminal suspects.
So what are potential outcomes in these kind of cases, Shannon? I mean, obviously there's the rewarding of damages to the victims of the abuse, but are there other outcomes you hope to see achieved?
Well, certainly we want to see change. I mean, certainly the outcome we want to achieve is empowered survivors with voices, changing institutions so that there are no more victims, so that sexual abuse stops. And so that people who are using positions of authority to gratify their sexual impulses are identified and pushed out of institutions as quickly as possible instead of emboldened. Success is stopping accomplices from working with those who abuse power because they're attracted to their power. So that's the sort of cultural shift and change we've really seen with the Me Too movement, and that we're seeing in every single institution of power is this knowledge that we can all do better, we can all be healthier, we can all have more powerful institutions if they're based on notions of equality as opposed to power over.
Are we seeing those changes in your opinion so far? Have there been some examples of those kind of institutional changes, and are you hopeful for more?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, like the way in which our culture is facing and addressing institutionalized racism, is that we have a language now for identifying systems that silence and oppress and isolate people based on their gender or on their ethnicity. And we're learning as a culture that we all lose when that happens. And that this is an approachable problem, and that it's going to be solved through the voices of those who are speaking from a position of experience and resilience. And so what we're seeing in the lives of survivors is, instead of lifelong oppression that ends in suicide, we're seeing a kind of voice and resilience. And that kind of cultural shift is inspiring. I mean, I have so much optimism about the systems of justice meeting these survivors and supporting their resilience and changing institutions for the better.
Fascinating information. Thank you so much for making some time to answer our questions. I do appreciate it, Shannon.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Ask the Lawyer. My guest has been New Mexico attorney Shannon Kennedy. I'll remind you, if you'd like to ask Shannon questions about your situation, go to askthelawyer.com, click the button at the top that says Ask a Lawyer, and there's a very simple process right there that'll walk you right through it. Thank you for watching. I'm Rob Rosenthal with Ask the Lawyers.